Hello and welcome. My name is Jaffar Hasnain. I'm a presenter and correspondent at TRT World. You know, when I was told that I will be hosting a panel on reporting from the front lines, I got very excited for two main reasons. Primarily because it is about the work that we do here at TRT World, and also it's because I am hosting two of my dear colleagues in this very panel. I want to start this by posing a question, actually. Do you know how many times humanity has seen wars in recorded history? Any idea? Anyone? You can make guesses as well if you want to. Okay, I see a hand over there. It's actually more than 10,000, and that's according to Wikipedia, not a trusted source, so it's perhaps an underestimation. And we learned about these wars, of course, through the ones who lived through these tragedies, the women, the children, and people who documented these wars. In modern day age, we know them as journalists. And that is exactly what we are going to discuss in this panel. Let me introduce my panelists, starting with Lotfullah Najafizada. He's the CEO of EMU TV. Thank you very much, Lotfullah, for being with us on this forum. Then Professor Stuart Allan, a professor of journalism at Cardiff University. Thank you very much, Professor. And then our very own Obaida Hito, a correspondent at TRT World. Thank you very much, Obaida. And last but not the least, Melinda Nusifora, a correspondent at TRT World. Melinda, thank you very much. I know you had a very busy day. I've seen you doing live hits throughout today and yesterday as well, and also hosting one-on-one. So thank you very much, Melinda, once again. You know, when I started journalism, I started watching a lot of movies about wars, and I would see journalists, you know, going to war zones and reporting on the tragedy and the fighting, the conflict. And the first thing that I thought at the time was war journalism is all about bravery. And Melinda, I want to put this to you. Is it all about bravery?
It might be all about bravery, but I think we run the risk of making it about our bravery, because I think and maybe this is because of social media or the way that a lot of our global vision has kind of become very self-centric. I think that there's a risk of making the stories that we cover in these conflict zones about our bravery being there and talking to the people, as opposed to the fact that we're there doing a service. It's part of our job to be there and documenting what those people are experiencing. So while, yeah, it can be a bit risky sometimes and it can be a little bit nerve-wracking at other times, I think the bravest people are the ones who are happy enough to tell our stories. Not only are they having to live through it in the first instance, they're happy enough to live through it again as they tell us their stories. And I think, yeah, that's definitely the focus that I try and bring to our reporting at TRT World.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Lotfullah, you have covered the war in Afghanistan, and recently we have seen many developments take place in the country that you come from. So what I wonder at this point is, given your experience, and you know, we have a very young audience here. I'm sure a lot of people who are here right now might be wondering, what does it take to be a war journalist? How would you navigate through this?
Being a war journalist is primarily about understanding and telling the stories of people who live in the middle of war. And in the context of Afghanistan, you're not talking about a few weeks of war. You're talking about not even a few years of war. You're talking about decades of war. We're talking about almost half a century of violence and confidence and conflict. And how you really understand the society, tell the stories of the people who have lived through it, generations, I think that is primarily the job of journalists, and not only in Afghanistan, but in so many other areas around the world. I think it's sometimes it's unfortunate that journalists do not necessarily take the time to really look deeper into the root causes of conflict, which is probably what we need most. Let's not reduce conflict reporting to just sort of a showcase of being there and trying to just touch the surface. I think there's a lot that we miss. I see that in the case of Afghanistan, because I was not only there as a journalist, but I was in Afghanistan also as a citizen, born and raised there, and lived throughout conflict. So you could feel that there was a lot about your life that was not necessarily reported in the media, including our own media.
Okay. Thank you very much. Ubaida, you have covered the war in Syria extensively. Tell me, what are your thoughts on war journalism? If I'm not mistaken, you have been doing this for more than 4 years now.
Reporting from a conflict anywhere, whether it's in Syria or not, comes with a lot of baggage. So when you're going, you really don't know what to expect until you get there, because people are living in this war zone and you're coming as an outsider, like you're going to visit somebody's home or you're going to visit somebody else's place. So you are an outsider, and it's hard to basically, when you arrive in this place where this war and this conflict is going on, people are definitely not comfortable with your presence, but at the same time know that you're there doing a job. You're not necessarily, because you're a journalist, of course, you're there to tell a story. So they might be welcoming, but when you go into this place, the hardest thing is to not get sucked into that, to not become the story, as Melinda and Lotfullah mentioned, not to become the story and to tell the story that's happening there. Because when you go to these places, people are so desperate just to find somebody to listen to them, to talk to explain, because they think that they might be able to explain to you and you might be able to fix their problem, but you're not there to fix their problem, you're there to share their problem with the rest of the world. So it's the most difficult thing is not getting sucked into that trap of trying to solve people's problems and instead help tell their story and share their problem with the rest of the world. And then there's this issue about Syria, which is similar to Afghanistan, I should say, even though I haven't reported from Afghanistan. And it's become a long-term kind of conflict. And so the suffering has become layered and it's become generational. So even if you reported on Syria in 2012, if you go back today to Syria in 2022, you're going to find even more suffering, even more stories to tell. As a journalist, that makes me feel so excited because I can do a lot of work and I love to work, so it's easy for me to go and find stories to tell. But is that really a good thing? Like, as humans, is that a good thing that 10 years later, journalists are having to go and tell these stories again? I don't know. And I, until now, after doing this for several years, have mixed feelings about that. Do we really need to be telling these stories 10, 20 years from now? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't have the answer to that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ubaida. Professor Allan, I'd like to come to you now. As I mentioned in my opening statement that humanity has seen more than 10,000 wars in recorded history. I mean, that's an estimation, and that's according to Wikipedia, not a trusted source. You have researched on journalism. You teach journalism at Cardiff University. Tell me, how do you think war journalism has evolved?
It's a very interesting question. Thank you for the opportunity to participate on a panel with people who have engaged in war reporting. I will aim to offer something akin to an academic perspective on this, but I hasten to add I've not been a war journalist myself. I think, depending on how you define war and depending on how you define journalism, they have been intertwined from the emergence of both in many ways. Storytelling from the various earliest points in human civilization. So to kind of offer up a kind of a broad sense of that trajectory that you're describing there, I think would be fascinating, very good subject for a book, actually. But in thinking it through, I suppose, picking up on what colleagues on the panel have already highlighted, there is a transitional shift underway at the moment, and that is, up until fairly recently, we looked to the war reporter to bear witness on our behalf. we, members of the distant public, who had little comprehension of what was actually going on in a conflict zone, and we relied on the journalists to arrive on the scene. And sometimes that looks like parachute journalism or helicopter reporting and so forth that we would describe. The war correspondent arrives on the scene, has to figure out instantly what's going on, reports in a very short period of time, and then is off to the next kind of conflict, the next trouble spot around the planet. Increasingly now, what we're seeing is a very different kind of ecology emerging, whereby increasingly people are taking it upon themselves to bear witness, courtesy of having a smartphone or access to the internet, able to kind of share their stories, their video footage they may have taken from a camera phone or digital camera, going online across social media platforms in order to say, here I am, this is what's happening in my community, let me show you what war looks like. And it is often raw, and it's visceral, and it's difficult, and it's disturbing, and it doesn't respect kind of the traditional journalistic values we might otherwise expect. But many people see that as a good thing, and see that as something really positive that people are doing in the situation and contributing to newsmaking. So I think that then invites a very different kind of degree of introspection on the part of professional journalists, saying, how best do we engage with citizens who are on the ground?
And that's what we call citizen journalism these days, right? Now, Melinda, you have covered multiple wars. You have covered the war in Syria, the war in Azerbaijan, in Karabakh, and most recently, the war in Ukraine. What I wonder at this point is, how do you ensure, as a journalist, your own safety? For example, at times when you're covering wars, you have to, even if you don't want to, you have to coordinate or perhaps work with people who are non-state actors, people who might be involved in illegal terrorist activities. So how do you balance yourself out with these people?
Well, I think firstly, it comes down to sort of a journalistic ethical choice as to whether you think that the people you may be embedding with are reliable and are a legitimate source of information, because that's one of the hardest things in conflict reporting. Everyone is coming at it with their own angle, you know, there's multiple sides to every story, and in a conflict everyone wants their side to be the opinion that gets the most airtime. So I mean, you really have to kind of juggle the competing narratives. But I think that on a personal level, you can't tell the story if you're putting yourself in danger. You can't tell the story successfully and accurately and with an open and balanced objective mind if you are putting yourself in incredibly risky situations. So I think it's always a team effort, something that you and your team sit down together and decide, are we going to go into this area? Are we going to go with these people? Do we feel safe? I think for me, the main thing comes down to my team and being able to discuss with them at the end of each day, how did that day go? And at the beginning of the next day, do we feel safe with the plan that we have in place, or do we need to amend it in any way? And that's when local knowledge and having good local contacts comes into place, because like Ubaida said, at the end of the day, we just kind of arrive in a region. We may be very familiar with it, we may have reported on it multiple times, but wars change, and as you say, that's layered and it's always developing. So you really need to have reliable local contacts, and you need to have trust in your team. If you can't trust your team, you don't have anything. Okay,
let me add one more question here. So the primary idea here is your own safety, because if you're not safe, of course, you cannot report and tell the world what's going on in the region that you're reporting on. How much risk can be taken? How do you calculate that?
And I'm going to use an example from an Australian foreign correspondent colleague of mine who works for Australia's national broadcaster. His name's Max Utrich, and he said something that has always really stuck with me. And he said that journalists are a very unique type of person, because when a bomb goes off over there, everyone runs that way, and a journalist runs that way. because we want to know what happened and we want to be able to tell people about it. And to me, that really rings true, because if there is something going on, I instinctively want to run towards it, whereas I think a lot of other people will want to run in the opposite direction. So I think that is perhaps why we get into this game in the first place. And then,
if I may, so when we enter journalism, especially war journalism, we are basically, in a way, signing up for something that could kill us.
You are, of course you are. And we make those choices, and they're the choices that we make, but unfortunately it's our families that have to deal with that, right?
Right.
We get to make those choices, and we can only make them based on the best information we have at the time. And we just have to be very blessed with supportive families who are happy to let us do the job that we love.
Right, and I attended a war journalism forum in Ankara about a month ago or so, and I remember this one journalist said at the time that it's always good to know how much risk you are taking, because your safety is, of course, #1 priority. And if you act dumb or super heroic in a way, you would become a press intro yourself. People will read your intro for 30 seconds on TV, and then you're gone. So it's always good to know how much risk should be taken. And of course, as Melinda said, you need to know the reliable sources there and know the area, talk to the locals there and all. And of course, the trust in the team is very important. Thank you very much, Melinda. Now, Ubaida, I want to ask you something about how do you basically balance out reporting while you're in a conflict zone on something that is very sensitive. Again, if you're embedded with someone who might be involved in illegal terrorist activities, how do you ensure that you don't say anything that might put your life in danger?
I think Melinda explained very well about this issue of dynamics, team dynamics, and who you're working with, knowing where you're going. And I think that's really the most important thing, because when you go into a conflict zone, like you're saying, Jaffar, people from different backgrounds, different interests, different agendas are going to be present. And in conflict zones, people are going to have guns and weapons and are going to have different kinds of motivations. And they might even be trying to use journalists, right? So some militia group that has guns and is in control of some kind of geographic region might say, hey, please come, you're a journalist, I want to use you. He might not say it like that, or they might not say it like that, but they'll tell you, please, we want to give you an interview. We want to talk to the international community. So as a journalist, it might be an opportunity to speak to one of these people who represent some sector of that particular conflict, right? But is it worth that risk? Then that's where you come in and have to try and measure that risk. How much risk do I want to take? Where do I want to go? How far am I willing to go? And these things turn into sagas, in some cases, because to get some of these kinds of interviews that you're mentioning, for example, you might have to go through checkpoints that you wouldn't normally go through, for example, in a conflict zone. You might have to go into uncharted territory, if you'll allow me to use that word. Climb up a mountain, walk for kilometers. You and your team are going to have to do things that normal journalists wouldn't do. It's not like you're standing outside in the lobby and talking into a microphone. You're going to have to make an effort. And that's where you have to really kind of take into account the risk that you're taking and consider, is it worth talking to these people? As a journalist, I believe everybody should be able to reach the media. If you want to tell me, oh, this guy is a militia member or this guy is an army member from any country, I, as a journalist, am obliged to speak to both sides. I can't say, oh, I'm only going to be speaking to this one side. But at the same time, if I'm a journalist and I can't reach that location safe enough, or even that militia group cannot guarantee my safety as a journalist, then I'm going to say, okay, well, I might not speak to them. But if they tell me, no, we will guarantee we'll meet in kind of like a neutral zone and talk, then I think that managing that is something that we do every day. Melinda knows how this works, Lotfullah knows how this works, and this is crisis management. But it's not like your normal crisis management, like, guys, we have a problem in a month, let's try and fix it. This is like 24 hours a day crisis management with your team, and it's all about having people you trust and having a plan, right? And without those trust and planning, it's not going to be a very kind of fruitful endeavor, in my opinion.
Okay, so pre-planning is key here, and also, knowing the people you are working with. Lotfullah, now, over the past 2 decades, many journalists were killed in the country that you come from, Afghanistan, while covering the war. How do you ensure your own safety in a country where you know that your life is at risk at every point, basically? There have been so many bombings in Afghanistan, especially, in fact, there was one about a few weeks ago.
Right. Afghanistan has been one of the deadliest countries for journalists, but at the same time, until the return of the Taliban, it was one of the freest countries for media. So it was such a paradox. We ranked 122 on the World Press Freedom Index in 2021. And with the return of the Taliban, it fell to 156 just in 1 year. That achievement of free press in the past 20 years was as a result of the sacrifices of the journalists. The Afghan media was at some point an industry of about 10,000 people. And I'm happy to see that there are still thousands of journalists in Afghanistan. As an editor, our job in Kabul was to refuse journalists going to the battlefield, while journalists wanted to go to the battlefield. And it was not the other way around.
Actually, let me ask you this question. Since you are at a position, a managerial position, and you have a correspondent who's very motivated about covering this war, and he's young, and he wants to take that risk, but you are the one who are calling the shots. You are the one taking that decision. What goes through your mind? How do you decide?
I think Afghanistan, we still have. I don't think there's an end of conflict there. Maybe some sort of a reduction in violence or a pause in conflict. But traditionally, we had a security checklist before an editorial checklist to make sure the journalists have their helmets, their vests. They use, in the last years to the fall of Kabul, we were using, even in the city, for probably some non-conflict stories, we were using armored vehicles, armed protection. And some of my colleagues were not even living in one house for a week. So it's not just during the assignment. When you live in that city, it is your 24/7 life. It's about where you live and what kind of security measures you have in place. When everybody's your enemy, from government to the insurgents, to terrorists, to gunmen, to strongmen, to warlords, to drug lords, to militias, I think and to corrupt officials, it's quite difficult to navigate that space and remain impartial in the same time, which I think...
If I may interject again, now as you said, everyone is an enemy. Are you indicating that perhaps as war journalists, we should keep that in our mind all the time when we are covering war zones and conflict, that everyone around us, it could be an enemy? So it's always good to be vigilant.
Could be a risk.
Not to trust everyone.
Yes.
Around us.
Could be a risk. I think particularly for visiting journalists coming from other countries, we have had many examples of journalists coming to Afghanistan and being killed while being embedded with the army. So I think that is also a risk. But as I see that there are so many students here, might be journalism students as well, I agree that no story worth your life. So that is quite fundamental to note.
Okay.
But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't go for stories. I think what kills journalists is also lack of local knowledge, lack of preparation, lack of awareness. What my colleagues were describing, the day in and day out planning. I think that is some of these reckless decisions result into loss of journalists, who of course are exposed to risks no matter what. Journalists have been killed being in a hotel, just arriving in a city, not being on the front line. In certain areas, front line is everywhere. It's not just where bullets are
right.
fired.
Thank you very much. Professor, I'm not sure if academia has a way through which it can teach students who want to become war journalists how much risk should one take? Is there anything like that when you teach journalism to students?
We do our best to alert students to the risks and to prepare them precisely along the lines that my fellow panelists have been describing, recognizing that these are really difficult, challenging circumstances and can be quite traumatic, and that needs, there's a duty of care there, news organizations to their journalists, but also I think as educators we bear some of that responsibility as well, to send people off into the world adequately prepared to be resilient and to recognize the dangers that are there and act accordingly. I think at the same time what we're trying to do though is to encourage them to think about war reporting differently, and that is to recognize that we have to kind of get past some of the limitations that have come to be associated with war reporting, to rethink its values, its priorities, its conventions, to change the way in which we report on conflicts, so as to invite broader public engagement. And I think that means being responsible to themselves, crucially staying alive and staying safe and mediating the risks that you've been describing, but at the same time recognizing their responsibility to the men, the women, and the children that are in the war zone as well, and to recognize that they have to ensure that that is first and foremost on their minds as well.
Professor, I know that you have written a book on reporting from the front lines, and that book includes a lot of examples from the war in Iraq. We see many young faces sitting here right now. What would be your advice to them who want to become journalists, war journalists? What would you tell them based on your studies and research?
Yeah. That's a very good question. I think I would encourage everyone to slow down and ask themselves why they want to be a war journalist. It's a good place to start. And depending on your answer, and I would road test that with other people and listen carefully to what you get by way of feedback. That does invite, I think, a certain degree of self-reflection and recognition that you are going to be putting yourself into harm's way. And I think you need to be really clear about your own motivations, and they need to be the right sorts of motivations rather than some of the more sort of, celebrated ones or romanticized perhaps in some of the Hollywood film treatments and the like, and recognize just how serious an endeavor this is. But at the same time, I would admire and respect anyone who saw this as something which was an extension of what they were otherwise about, saw this as something which they could contribute to finding positive solutions going forward, albeit in a fairly modest way. I wouldn't want to overstate the significance of what one person can achieve in these contexts. But as I'm sure other panelists would point to with their own personal experiences, when you do make a positive change, when you do make a connection or bring to light something which otherwise would have been kept hidden or off camera, and share that and know that you are bringing out voices that would otherwise not be heard, that must be a professionally very rewarding experience, and maybe helps to offset, at least to some extent, the kind of risks that were taken in order to achieve it.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now, certainly war journalists are not superhuman beings. They're human beings after all. And that brings me to the topic that I've always wanted to discuss when it comes to war journalism: mental health. There are times war journalists see stuff that no one of us would ever want to see in their lives. And many war journalists go through this tragedy themselves. Melinda, how do you deal with your own mental health when you see children starving, people dying right in front of your eyes? You could hear bullet rounds in the back. What goes through your mind, and how do you deal with that?
It's a real balance and a real battle, I think, because again, you don't want to make the story about you, but there are certain elements of it that you are also experiencing. I think that, again, it comes down to your team. You need to be able to rely on each other because, as Ubaidah was saying, it is 24 hours. It's not just when you're in front of the camera or you're doing the interview that you're thinking about the story and the conflict and the implications of it. It's every day, all day. It's when you go to sleep. It's during the night when you wake up to the sound of rockets or air raid sirens. You are kind of existing in this level of heightened alert, and it's really exhausting. That I think we should do more. I think we should do better I think across every network that I've ever worked in, there's always the offer that there is someone to talk to or that there is a debrief process. But journalism is busy, and we always just end up having to be, you go on to the next job and you push yourself onto the next story. I think that as journalists, we probably should do better to debrief. I mean, I personally, from my previous network that I worked with, I have 2 colleagues who suicided while they were working, and even though I know exactly the worst case scenario, I still don't debrief enough after my deployments. So I think it's something that we all probably should do better. I think communicating it with your family or your friends, having someone as a bit of a sounding board is really important. But I don't know, maybe the university has a better way of educating us to deal with it, because it's definitely not something I think journalists are kind of good at. We're good at telling other people's stories, but maybe not really dealing with our own.
Correct. And since you mentioned, academia, let me put this to Professor Allan. Does academia have something that teaches journalists how to protect his or her mental health while covering conflicts?
It's a fairly recent development to recognize that, I think, in part for precisely what's been said, and that is journalists themselves now, I think, are increasingly open to discussing these things and recognizing the ways in which they've had to kind of cope with these types of difficulties and the implications that's had for their own mental well-being. And I think journalism education is starting to reflect that. I think in the past it's always been a sense of physical safety, and we do put our students through their paces. There's harsh environment training, there's a variety of different things that occur so that they are suitably resilient in a physical sense. But that mental dimension in terms of their own sense of self, their own sense of dealing with the horrors that they might very well encounter and under terrible circumstances at times, is relatively new, and it's one which is still being developed, I think, and further work needs to be done within journalism education to improve upon that dimension.
Okay, thank you. Ubaida. Melinda said, as journalists, we're not so good when it comes to protecting our mental health. Now, you have covered the war in Syria extensively. Tell me, what are your thoughts? Is there a certain thing that you do after you come back from covering a conflict in order to protect yourself and, protect your mental health?
I don't think I ever come back from the conflicts that I report from. And I think this is about what you decide you want to do with your career, whether you want to be a war journalist or not. As soon as you get involved in a conflict, even as a journalist, you become part of it because you're telling the story there. You have to be passionate, and you have to accept the risk that you're taking to do these kinds of things. I didn't become a journalist by choice. I became a journalist by chance. And I was experiencing conflict and armed conflict many years even before I started at TRT World. I even have shrapnel in my body from a conflict that had nothing to do with my journalist career. And that experience as a whole pushed me to continue this storytelling experience that I've engaged in now. So my whole life, because of the way that I operate now and because of the work that I do, has become a storytelling experience. Because now I have to explain everything that I've seen and reported and heard, not only to people who are listening to TRT World's reports, but I have to explain it to my kids. I have to explain it to my wife, to my dad, to my mom, to people I meet for the first time. And those are two different experiences. Reporting for journalistic purposes, and then reporting for my own kind of cathartic experience. because it's a very stressful thing that we're doing. And war journalists in general, you will find them kind of high-strung, even though Melinda tries to play it cool. When you meet war journalists, you will tell, and we heard this from our panelists, that they're a different breed, and that's true, and I'm not trying to boast here. But I know people who've been doing this a lot longer than me, and they are definitely different than your average journalist. The people who are actively going in and out of conflict zones for 20, 30 years are definitely built different, think different, and operate differently than your average journalist who's reporting for your Sunday paper. And this is something people should understand. And in my opinion, I think the professor mentioned a little bit about this, and Lotfullah also mentioned the industry itself, because I'm new. I'm the most junior one here, I think, on this panel in terms of like years of experience. But the industry itself is changing so fast over the last 5 years, starting with the Arab Spring and then to where we are now. The industry has changed so fast. People can put information on the internet. People can make you the news. You're the journalist in the field reporting, and then you can become the news. Journalists are being kidnapped. Journalists are being, used as political, cards. So it's a very interesting situation that war journalists are in general, and then trying to deal with that mentally and emotionally. For me, the easiest and best way has been to kind of explain what I'm seeing to people who would listen, talking about it.
Let it out of your system.
Like you, get it out of your system, move on. Because as soon as that conflict is done, you're going to be, if you're a war journalist, you're going to be moving to another conflict. And people are going to be sad, people are going to be anxious, people are going to be angry. And it's just going to keep going. And if you want to be working in this specific part of journalism, this war reporting, if you want to call it, you need to be ready for a high stress, high intensity, and a lot of really angry moments. But at the end, you're going to be able to laugh about it and talk about it, especially when you have good teammates and you have a good channel and you're passionate about your work. It's easy to laugh it off. Unfortunately, a lot of our colleagues, don't make it that far. And I think it's the industry's fault, because the industry puts a lot of pressure on people like myself, maybe, and Melinda, to go, 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 go. But how far can a person go? So then this comes back to an individual choice, right? As an individual, am I ready to go out on a limb to try and tell these stories, even though there are all these risks? And it's a balancing act. It's difficult, but it's doable.
And that is perhaps something that is a war journalist's mistake. We're so consumed by, keeping going on, moving forward, reporting on the story. So at times we forget that we are also human beings. We have a brain which can get affected by seeing tragedies after tragedies.
Right.
So is that a flaw within the industry, perhaps on an organizational level, Lotfullah? Do you think media organizations especially, they should incorporate perhaps some sort of sessions for journalists on mental health, especially for the ones who are reporting from war zones?
Right. Well, let me just say that explaining to the wife part is probably the most difficult, because when you're not feeling well and then your wife thinks that there's a problem with her, every time there's an issue which could be unrelated to your marriage. But I must say, from where I come from, mental health is a taboo, is a stigma. I mean, nobody talks about it. It's a shame when you talk about it. It's a cultural issue. So you do not necessarily sort of go and see someone when you have a problem.
I'm sorry if I'm interjecting. I don't think that's just limited to the country that you come from. I know journalists who don't like talking about it.
Indeed.
Because
Indeed.
I don't know, perhaps that what I feel is they want to pretend that they are very strong, but we are all human beings. That's not the case in most of the cases.
I think that needs to change. But when you are a local reporter, I mean, everybody around you, from your family to your colleagues to people on the street, everybody needs mental health support. I think that's where, your problem is not necessarily a top priority. But at an industry level that you asked, I think journalism has evolved as a whole. The way the flow of information is happening in the world has evolved and has changed quite significantly with the evolution of social media and citizen journalism. And that's where, and the way war is reported. And a lot of war reporting is happening based on citizen journalism, particularly from places like Afghanistan, where access to information is quite difficult. And also in the case of Ukraine, how much access is there in the Russian-occupied or controlled territories, for instance, and where information is coming from those areas, and how to verify, let's say, those information. I think it's for the editors, for senior journalists, and for journalists who are on the front line to revisit the way we are actually reporting about conflict. Because this certainly has huge impact and significance on the way people are consuming content. Are we seeing the same side of the story in the West compared to the East when it comes to, let's say, to the war in Ukraine? I think that's something that we all need to ask ourselves, that how war journalism and journalism as a whole is part of the conflict or not. Is being used as a tool or not. I think the whole sort of conflict reporting needs further sort of investigation, and maybe universities can do more about it.
Okay.
There are so much lessons learned. Look at the polarization of not just politics but also war reporting in the recent years.
Okay, great points. Melinda, Lotfullah mentioned about how journalists should report and try to balance out the narrative coming from the West and the other side of the world. And we have seen examples of that, especially during the war in Ukraine. And I have to say, some journalists, some sound journalists, seasoned journalists, have made pretty big mistakes while covering those conflicts. For example, in the case of Ukraine, there were journalists who compared the refugees fleeing from Ukraine to refugees fleeing from Syria, calling them more civilized, if I may. Is that ignorance?
Look, I think that obviously in the heat of the moment anyone can misspeak, but I think that it doesn't matter if it's a conflict zone or a politics story or a story about the economy. We aren't here to take sides, and it needs, I think, while I don't necessarily think that journalism is the kind of career that needs a lot of formal higher education, I do think that one of the best things I learned at university in my journalism career was the ethics and morals of journalism. It gives you a solid foundation and an understanding of the power of the media and why it is so important that, be it conflict, be it any other kind of reporting, we are balanced, we're observers, and we're telling the stories of those people. And it's unfortunate if sometimes a certain reporter's personal views or ignorance, as you described it, may come out if they've found themselves in a situation that perhaps they're not prepared for. But I think that in this day and age, the world is so interconnected, seeing it as an us versus them, an East versus West. I mean, it really, surely in this day and age, we're kind of getting to the point where that should be changing. Unfortunately, it's not. You can see some real differences in the reporting from Ukraine, from an American network compared to a network based in Europe, compared to what my colleagues in Australia might be covering. But I think regardless of which network or newspaper or radio station you're coming from, there is the bare minimum expectation is that you're fair, accurate, and impartial. And if you're not doing that, then you're not doing the job right from the get-go, let alone telling the story correctly.
Great points there, Melinda. And I would like to add one more element here, especially when you're covering wars. And this is something that a journalist that I look up to, had told me last year that you also have to be sensitive to the tragedies of the ones who are living through wars. Ubaida, I'm going to give you an example, and I'm sure this is something that many journalists have come across, especially while covering wars. At times you have to speak to someone who has just lost his or her child. I mean, how do you ask a question which doesn't make that person feel, bad about the loss of her child? I mean, how do you ensure that you're not insensitive to the situation that he or she is in? Ubaida.
So I guess I'll answer you first with another example. Everybody here grew up, we were all kids before, so everybody knows what I'm talking about. They have this kind of like candy, it's sugar, powdered sugar. When we were kids, I'm sure everybody got a little bit of powdered sugar in their hands. And you used to like lick your finger or your whole hand if you want, and then stick it in the powdered sugar and then lick the sugar off of your hand, right? So I think everybody can relate to that kind of experience, or even something else if you want, peanut butter, yogurt, whatever it is. When you come across someone, and this is something that I experienced personally, and it was actually very early on in my reporting career as an actual reporter, and it was with a cameraman of mine who I've spent the last several years working with. He's here in the audience, Farouk, so he knows exactly what I'm talking about, because he's the one who actually shot this footage. We saw it together, we both witnessed this, but he's the one who got the footage, so it probably affected him more because he's the one who actually got it in his frame. And that's a whole different issue I'll get to in a second. But imagine a kid sitting in Syria underneath a tree, displaced from his home, and it's a kid, right? It's a child, so it's got to be 3, 4 years old. It's an infant child sitting in the dirt underneath a tree. Basically what the child did, and I'm not going to do it here on stage, but I can explain it to you, he licked the bottom of his foot. The child licked the bottom of his foot, stuck it in the dirt, and then the dirt got stuck to the bottom of his foot. And then if you can imagine, the kid lifted his foot. They're much more flexible than we are when we get old. And he was sitting on the floor and he lifted his foot to his mouth and licked the dirt off of his foot, okay, because of his hunger or tiredness, whatever it is. But seeing that kind of thing, right? Whether it's somebody who's lost a child, right, or a mother, or because I've been in many situations where it's instantaneously after the calamity, explosion, right after the explosion, attack right after. I've seen these kinds of scenes, right? I've been there. The issue here is not about how are you going to ask them a question to get information from them. The question is why are you there, right? What story are you really there to tell, okay? Am I just there to say, oh wow, something blew up, look at how cool? Or am I there to understand why this thing blew up, how it's affecting people, what it's going to do to people, to this community, whether immediately or in the medium to long-term future? Who reported about similar issues or similar situations in that same spot? Is it the first time? Is it the last time? Has this happened every day for the last 10 years? So it's more about why are you there? That image that you're going to share with the world, whether it's the kid who's sitting underneath a tree licking the dirt off his foot because he's hungry and cold and doesn't know what else to do, or if it's the mother who lost his child, you need to understand you as a human being, whether you're a war journalist or not. As a human being, why are you there? If you're there to just show off, it's going to reflect in your work, in my opinion. And my colleagues here are all professionals, so they know exactly what I'm talking about. If you're there to be the story, it's going to show. But if you're there to really tell the story of the people who are affected by these conflicts that we're reporting about, then those stories are going to make an impact on a global level. And I think that's why I enjoy personally, and I'm passionate about being here at TRT World.
Okay.
And it is a privilege to be here because we're giving a voice to the voiceless. And that's been kind of my motivation, as a reporter in the field, and what keeps me motivated, and what I keep telling my wife that I'm doing, and that's why I keep doing what I'm doing. So she's over there, hopefully she believes me.
Ubaida, thank you very much. Now you mentioned cameraman Farouk. I just want to acknowledge this one fact here. Of course, what you see sitting here among journalists are the ones who appear on a screen, but a correspondent especially is nothing without his or her cameraman. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank all cameramen working here at TRT World. And I also see some very seasoned journalists sitting right in front of us, starting with the director of TRT World, Mr. Bora Bayraktar, who has himself covered many wars, especially the one between Israel and Palestine. So thank you very much once again for your presence here. Now, before I end this, we're not done yet. We'll keep moving on. Ubaidah mentioned one thing, and what I gathered from what he said is you're a human being first and a journalist after that. And that's how you report on a story.
Yes, I think it's a responsibility to tell this, to know the story you're telling. Otherwise, you're not telling it the way you should tell. I think it's important to really understand the story. I mean, there are interesting examples that if you're there to report an incident or a bomb, and then you see a wounded child lying on the street, what are you going to do? Are you going to report about it, or are you going to help him or her? I mean, these examples are being taught at journalism schools, around the world. But I think what I wanted to mention is what is fundamental now, the current situation, is that we have to keep journalism above politics. That is probably a service that we can do to the industry, to the people who put their lives at risk. And that is, and to make sure that journalism as a profession remains pure and clean and not as a subject of politics and not being used. I think that's what the world needs. This race for first news, first footage, I think has been challenged by social media everywhere in the world. I think we need to certainly have a different look at how we cover conflict. And most importantly, again, we appreciated, of course, people who visit front lines and cover stories, but also local journalists, fixers, right, drivers. I'm sure you get all of those helps when you travel to conflict zones. I think they are essential parts of news gathering.
So it's teamwork,
right? And it's important to. I mean, they're also your eyes and ears. When you visit a place and then you leave, but they don't leave, right? They're there. And they live the story. I think it's very important to also recognize them. And sometimes it gets tough. I must, coming back to the question of mental health, I think, sometimes I question myself that the journalist who died and I hired 5 years ago, did I make the right choice? Did I make a mistake by hiring him in the first place? And he died 5 years later. And some other decisions that you make that are really a matter of life and death for journalists, I think stays with you. When an attack happened on our colleagues in 2016, 7 of my colleagues lost their lives. We started reporting about the attacks before knowing that the bus was was carrying our colleagues. And then some of us were collecting dead bodies while other colleagues were reporting about the incident. And then we were balancing the same story by talking to the Taliban, making sure that our journalism piece is professional, while it's personal, it's close to you. And then since then, every year at the New Year or at the Eid, we go to their families, meet their mothers, get to know them. I mean, I've gotten to know some of these fallen journalists more after they have lost their lives through their family members and through their loved ones. So it's really, really difficult. And that's why, in order to make it worthwhile for you, in order to make it, to make sure you don't misuse the opportunity of being a journalist, is to make it apolitical, to make the industry, to make the profession as impartial as it can be. I certainly believe that the journalism and democracy as a whole, and journalism in particular, is under attack. And our number one enemy probably today is fake news. And that's being, unfortunately, fueled by politics, by state actors, by formal actors. So it's very, very important for us to appreciate that, understand that, and try to deal with it.
All right. Great points there, Lotfullah. Now, Professor, he mentioned one thing about protecting journalism and ensuring that journalism is ethical and it's fair. How does a news organization ensure that?
I think by cultivating honesty. I think journalists, as has been pointed out, they've often find themselves being deliberately targeted. Many journalists have paid a very high price, the ultimate price with their lives, others imprisoned for having had the audacity to try to seek out the facts of a situation. And I think when it comes to that sense of morality, that's where that starts, I think, because the stakes are so high. But I think when it comes to trying to think about how best to kind of improve the quality of journalism, it's recognizing that impartiality itself is something to strive for, but it's never going to be perfectly achieved. And I think, you know, if you look back at earlier examples of war reporting, right back in the 1950s when it sort of emerged in a televisual sense, you'll see how robotic so many of the middle-class white men reporters, because they were almost exclusively so in Western context, certainly in a British context, were at the time. They had that kind of view, I think, that they had to somehow separate facts from values. They had to be seen to be not personally invested in anything that they were relaying to their public. And now it looks anachronistic. It looks almost so contrived and so fake that you think this is almost inhumane in the same breath. And I think we've come a long way since then now, and I think journalists recognize that they strive to do their best to be as honest as they can, to admit mistakes when they make them, and also to kind of give the audience some credit too. I mean, recognizing that people will fact check what's being said, right. They will express views on social media, they will pick up gaps and inconsistencies and lapses of judgment. So it's really important to kind of slow down, to resist that kind of rush to judgment, to try to do the best that one can under the circumstances, but contextualize reporting in that way too, and to kind of say to the audience in a very open and frank way, this is my understanding of what's happening, and I'm trying my best to kind of figure things out on your behalf.
You know, certainly war journalism is a profession that comes with a lot of challenges, and we've spoken about those challenges, but I'm sure my colleagues here are going to agree with me that we do take pride in our work, primarily because we are telling stories of human beings. So I want to end this panel now by asking a yes or no question to my three journalist friends who are sitting here. And I'm sure this is something that people who are present in the audience, especially the youngsters, might be wondering. To be a war journalist or to not be a war journalist? Melinda.
Just with a yes or no?
You can add one or two sentences if you like.
Thanks very much, thanks, because I'm very rarely short of a word. Yes, because I've been a journalist for nearly 20 years now, 19 and a half. I obviously started very young, and I got into this because I love telling people's stories. Yes, it's about politics and the economy, but at the end of the day, all of that affects people, and I love being able to tell people's stories. And if unfortunately that is happening in a very, very stressful conflict situation, so be it. I wouldn't change it for the world.
All right. Obeida.
I would say you don't have to be a journalist, you don't have to be a war journalist, you just have to be human. Okay? Because at the end of the day, somebody might be reporting about your own conflict, and this is something we need to think about, okay? Whether you want to get involved in the sector or not, we all could become victims of a conflict that somebody like one of these people here could come and tell your story. So you want to keep that in mind when you don't have to be a journalist, you don't have to be a war journalist, you don't have to do anything, just be human, be kind, be merciful, be patient, and do your thing and tell people's story. And this is what journalists do, is they tell stories. So you don't necessarily have to do any of those things, just be human and be nice and smile, and things will work out, in my opinion. It's worked so far for me.
All right, and I hope it keeps working for you that way. Lotfullah.
I think be a journalist first, and a good one. With all due respect to all journalists who cover conflict, but every journalist is an important one. Every story is important, and front lines are not necessarily, as I said earlier, where bullets are being fired. Covering migration, covering hunger, and all other sorts of crises, are important. So be a good journalist, and then, of course, you become a good storyteller, so you can cover conflict as well.
All right. And this brings us to the end of this panel. Lotfullah, Professor Allan, Obaida, Melinda, thank you very much, and thanks to all of you. I think the job of a journalist is to question, and I see a lot of young faces present here. I'm young myself. I'm not saying that I'm too old, right? If you feel that you are someone who likes to question a lot, then follow your passion. You can be a journalist, and that's what we are seeing happen across the world right now with citizen journalism. With that, thank you very much once again, and I believe since this is the last session of TRT World Forum 2022, the forum has also come to an end. So thank you very, very much for taking out the time to come here to Istanbul if you have come from another country and spending 2 days with us. Certainly we had many different panels discussing issues ranging from climate change, misinformation, disinformation, the political landscape in Asia, Africa, and of course the Americas as well. I hope you are able to take something out of this forum when you go back to your homes, and perhaps also try to bring some sort of change to the world that we live in today. Thank you very much once again.